Good afternoon and welcome to the GMSD Board of Education work session, December 15th, 2022. It is now 4:05 p.m. First item on the agenda is are the revision of policies. And these are listed as adopt after one reading. I'm going to ask about that in a moment, but there are some reasons a little bit for, I think, at least one or two of those based on some state law stuff. But I do want, we'll talk about that as we go through, if we could, please. So that Superintendent Manuel.
Sure, you have before you the four policies that are up for revision, and I'll read through the rationale that each of you have. Revision of policy 2.4021, investment of idle funds. And as Ms. Speakman was going through her policy, she found that that policy was actually aligned to guidance for municipalities, not school districts. And so we comply with the Tennessee Internal School Uniform Accounting Policy. And so you see those language changes there in that policy just to align with our regulating body for 2.4021. There's not that need to necessarily waive that policy, but since we were doing these four policies, there wasn't the need for that policy to be waived, but we did put it in with this one. The other policies that we're going to discuss, Ms. Speakman thought it was the recommendation because those laws have already taken place. So she said, hey, just so you know, our policy's not in alignment right now with what it should be. So that's why she recommended waiving those, but know that the law is already in effect. Policy, our procedures aren't necessarily out of alignment, but just know that the policies would be, which is why she recommended waiving those after one reading. But if the board did not choose to do that, it wouldn't change our practice and what we are doing if that was a concern. Does anyone have questions on policy 2.4021? Idle funds?
Not a question, just a couple of edits. On first page, line 21, I'd strike the "and" since we now have 5 different types of investments there.
Okay, 1 second.
Here, you can just take that.
I'll take the change. Okay, I see.
And then on the second page, what line is?
You have line 4,
Line
Germantown
4,
Board of
just
Education instead of
struck
Germantown Municipal.
Yeah.
We will make those changes. I'll give this to Ms. Subramani.
That's all I had.
Are there other questions on that policy? Okay, then we'll go on to the second policy, which is emergency planning 3.202. Revisions are recommended to update citations, comply with state law, and update practices. So you can see the changes that we have include information about cybersecurity, cyber attacks into the policy. Ms. Vijay, there are changes recommended on this investment of idle funds policy. Line 21, strike the word "and" since there are several things under there. And on the back page, yes. Are there questions on emergency planning?
When we see cyber attacks listed here, that's an example, kind of like the ransomware circumstances that were happening a couple of years ago.
That's correct, and still
Okay.
continue to happen.
Yes. I guess we really became aware that school systems and municipal governments and even larger government entities were becoming more or increasingly susceptible to these type of occurrences. And so this is just going to, this is not something that we're doing in addition. We're already doing this, but it's more just updating the wording.
That's correct. It doesn't change practice what we're doing. This is something that our technology team works on 24/7. Yes, you know, because they will try to trick you all too
Yes.
when, with your emails.
But that's good. Yes.
So know that you have not won a large sum of money from an African prince. I think that was one that was going around for a while. Or give them gift cards. Yes.
Mr. Manuel's not in That's right, that's right.
Yes.
You were in that.
Yes. But yeah, it just aligns to the new state law.
And that was one because we just looked at that back, I guess, in the summer. So that was the primary change.
Yes.
Just
That's
updating
correct.
that. Okay. Any other questions or further discussion?
I had one question on the fire drills. I know this says requiring full evacuation every 30 school days with 2 in the first 30 full days. I didn't know, and I should have brought this up before the meeting, but I didn't know, is that required by law? Okay. Because I have heard that, you know, it's kind of upsetting and disrupting to some of our exceptional students. So I didn't know if there was a way to keep from having to evacuate everyone in that instance.
There's a mandatory checklist, and the state checks it. Thank you. And that is, they're very strict on that one for some
Gotcha.
reason.
And then my only other question is, what does the remote learning drill look like? I think we had a question about that before, and we were still waiting to hear like what the state wanted it to be.
So that's something that we still have not received good guidance for, but districts are passing around their policies. We just have to have it done, completed by the end of the year. So the examples of this, and as you know, we're a one-to-one district, so we have devices for all the students. So it can be as simple as, hey, teachers are making sure that all the students log on at the same time. They're able to access, and as you know, this is a daily occurrence for us in our schools. Can you get on Schoology? Can you get on your assignments? Is there a way to post these and pull these things down? So it's just a way to document that. But if you think about our students' use of their devices and those platforms, we're doing that every day. But there's a checklist that other districts have provided. But that's what it is, making sure that their devices work, they're able to log on, teachers are able to log on, post things, and parents can pull them down also. Are there any other questions on emergency planning? There was one, then I'm going to give Dr. Chatham credit for just making sure that we were looking at it. That we were talking about prior to the meeting about in events of pandemics. As you know, one of the things that this board worked hard for was separating responsibilities of the health department versus the school board. And so now when we talk about cooperation, it does not mean that we are giving authority over to other agencies, because you know there is a state law now that helps us separate those responsibilities, which we are very thankful for. So we had a good discussion about what that looked like when we were going through the last pandemic. So
Yeah, I just wanted to be sure that language wasn't going to lock us into a goal or having to, that we would be able to navigate that to best serve our students without having somebody else navigate for us. But
so the word cooperate does not give away authority for us. So that was one of our discussions. So I wanted to say, let the board know that that was something that we had talked about.
And we had championed, so glad it's cooperative.
Yes. Okay, that brings us, if we don't have anything else on emergency planning, to our third policy, which is 4.207, and so you can see the rationale. Once again, it's revising revisions recommended to update citation and comply with recent state board rule revision on English language acquisition.
The only suggestion I have on line 4, where EL first appears, we have it spelled out as English learners. On line 20, I think that's the first appearance of ESL. We don't have that spelled out to what that is. So just for consistency's sake, I mean, we know what it is, but I think English as second language should be pointed out there, similar to what we have in line 4.
We will make that addition.
Also, I think lines 8 through 10 and then 16 through 18 are duplicates. So I just strike one of those sets. either strike lines 8 through 10 or 16 through 18.
Yeah, it's these two. We will make that change. These are the same. Okay, if there are no other questions on that, it brings us to the fourth policy, which is graduation requirements. Policy 4.605. So just to bring everybody up to speed, know that this policy change doesn't change the graduation requirements. It just allows for a new type of distinction on a diploma, and that's the Industry 4.0 diploma. And it talks about all the requirements that you see there to graduate with that distinction. So like I said, it wouldn't change procedures in the schools. It just changes, and that would be for students now could graduate with that distinction if they've completed all of those things.
Looking through all of the, I guess, criteria, I guess you would have to pursue this, and it made it seem as though you had to pursue this starting in 10th grade, and you really, a student could do the majority of these things and technically not be working towards this distinction, but still be doing the majority of the things that are in the criteria.
That's correct.
So-
Until you really come to like B.1, where it talks about the American Job Center career coach
So
and have those
that's the-
individuals. Those would be those things that
The
practice-wise we'd have to make sure that we've
career
done those things.
labor professionals, and that's kind of the big differential,
Mm-hmm.
or the primary differential.
Mr. Opferman wondered if we should maybe reference the attendance policy, having satisfactory records of attendance. First page, line 11, or maybe at the end of the policy as a cross-reference.
Where would we?
So I'm not sure if that policy actually addresses
We will look.
what that's needed for.
We'll look and see, and if it
Yeah.
fits, that makes a good reference.
And I think Mr. Opferman has confirmed that he's in good stead with this to graduate.
Are there other questions on 4.605?
So based on, can you remind us the timeline? So as far as this new option, would this be for anybody kind of from this day forward available?
Yes.
Will it affect this year's senior class?
I don't believe so because they wouldn't have been able to complete that job coaching components.
This is exciting. Any other questions on the addition of the Industry 4.0 diploma to the graduation requirements? And we're gonna look into the attendance, and conduct, I guess, with that, for both.
Miss Estes, you
Since this policy will not affect the seniors this year, and I think the other three are now being considered and in the process of conforming to state law, I don't think any of them can be described as urgent, which would require a waiving of the first reading. If you'll recall, back when the last time I think the graduation policy was amended, Superintendent Manuel gave a very thorough explanation for the public as to why we waived the second reading. It explicitly affected the graduating class for that, well, actually it's this year's graduating class. And so there was a great need to immediately do it and not wait until the next board meeting. Your current policy says it's always, you know, we have a first and second reading unless it's for two situations. If it's an urgent matter, board always can waive the second reading. And Superintendent Manuel has shown you, you know, when you've got that situation. And then if it's just a housekeeping or clerical, it's like how many times do we find the word director still popping up? And, you know, change that word, that sort of thing. And I don't think, in my opinion, none of these policies fit either urgent or clerical housekeeping.
We have no issue with pushing it to a second reading.
So just a question, as I'm reading through this, is it possible that we do have students that have met with a career counselor or a career coach at some point? We haven't, you know, our senior class has, 450? We'll just use a round number. I mean, are we saying that no senior meets the guidelines set forth here?
So is the question a career counselor?
So in B it says you starting in the 11th grade shall meet no less than once per month with a career coach who has been approved, and so then it lists the outlines about meeting with a career coach. They don't have to be a career coach; they just have to meet with one.
And it says even before that.
Before the end of the 10th grade year, the student shall register with a regional American Job Center and other career counseling or community partner as approved by the student school. So it's something that had to have been done even before that. It's not something I accidentally met with a counselor. There's an intentional registration process.
Yeah, I guess I just want to make sure that no one's done that. Like, if we have a student that has gone through that, then obviously I
Right.
think we need to take care of this. If we can say with confidence none of the 450 seniors meet the criteria, then I think to Ms. Estes' point, this can wait.
Hello, way over there. We can definitely get clarification on that and ask the counselors, Ms. Schmidt and Ms. Kreitz, to reach out to the senior class just to see if anybody has registered with the Career Corps. So when the law was rolled out, they did not specify exactly which class it begins with. So I would like to get clarification on that. The way the law is phrased, it would have to begin with this sophomore class because by the end of their sophomore class, they're supposed to express intent. And I believe that was the intent of the law when it was rolled out, but we will definitely get clarification on when we're allowed to start putting that distinction on the diploma, on the transcripts and diplomas.
Yeah, thank you. I just didn't want to operate under any assumptions there, just because it'd be different if we had a class of 100, but when we're dealing with a class of 450, it's quite possible. So I don't want to rule that out. And I guess the question for you, Ms. Abel, on this as we go forward, is that something that the career counselors at the high school will socialize to the students to make sure they understand that this is something that's available?
Yes. In the beginning this semester, we have, by law, 10 days to notify students starting in January. 9th and 10th graders will all be notified. Their parents will be notified of the requirements to meet the industry distinction. So that is going to begin in January to notify all current 9th and 10th graders, because coming into 9th grade, you need to know these requirements as you're selecting your courses, as you're making your plan. So,
Thank you.
I mean, it really just sounds to me like this is not something you can fall into. This is going to be our current class of sophomores that are choosing or opting in, not a senior coming up on their graduation who, oh yeah, I did accidentally register, and I mean, I just don't think it's going to apply to any of the 450 that exist currently, because it wasn't an available option.
Right.
To that point.
I think the key here is, even if they had, we have not selected a job coach, which it says the district does. So even if they've met with one, we haven't said that's one of ours.
Any further questions on this policy? And then I have a question as far as procedure. If we were to take these policies off of the board action items, would they go, or would they stay there and we would just do a first reading?
We can add them to consent and we can change it in the approval of the agenda.
But you're not required to. You could at any time choose to vote on an item and just have it as a voting item there by itself, even if you're gonna have two readings. You could
So we
still
could
have.
leave it as is.
You could
and
leave the
then
agenda as is, everything as is, just
that's
knowing that we're not waiving. That would
first.
change your motion.
I will change the
Okay.
recommended motion. Yes,
That would probably be the cleanest way.
ma'am. Easiest way.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs.
Okay, so
Shivani.
what was decided to clarify for the
So
table?
agenda will stay the same, so that will still be a voting item. The only thing that will change will be the recommended motion. So if someone was choosing to vote on this, we don't have to move these to consent.
But why not just move it to consent and just have it be done and then you're done? I mean, and then we
Because
make the
that's what we
motion.
do anyway.
Because it's a two-step. If you move it to consent, you have to change the approval of the agenda.
But all we have to do is say, I move to approve the agenda
Amended
as
agenda.
amended.
As
That's it.
amended.
Yes, you can do it either ways. Whatever
Okay.
you all.
I mean, it's,
No preference either way. I'm just trying
I-
to do the cleanest way possible, and I want to make sure that we're acknowledging that we're not going to waive
We-
it.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's one less vote if we do it in consent.
okay.
That's what I'm saying. It's just one
Then
less
that's fine, then
vote.
that,
Yeah, and we typically on first reading do it in
Would do it
consent.
in consent,
So
then why
yeah,
would it be
it's, I
consistent?
think
That's
it's, I think we just clarify, when we approve the agenda that we're moving item, whatever,
9A.
9A to the consent and then the motion to, amend the agenda.
Mr.
or approve
Romani,
as
do you have
amended.
time to make those changes in the system?
thank you.
Don't mean to be argumentative. I just,
No, I want it to
less
be, the correct way and the smoothest way, and, okay, perfect. Which is why I asked, okay. Well, if no further questions about the policies, that we're gonna move to the consent agenda, that gets us to agenda item number 2, discussion on modular spaces. This is something we've requested, an annual update. I think we're getting maybe to the tail end of where we are.
Or the beginning end.
Or
It
the
depends on how
beginning.
you look at it.
That's right, that's a good point.
So one of the things that we had talked about before was when we chose to have modular classrooms on our campuses, the idea was to have something that was going to be temporary in order to deal with increasing student populations. And as we built Forest Hill Elementary School and rezoned the schools, we have seen we did a good job of zoning our numbers, and they're fairly consistent amongst the schools, and they actually fit the capacities of the buildings themselves. So now the challenge that we have is that as we have also been going through that process, the needs of the district have changed. And so we're going to highlight some of those needs that we have. I think when we started this district, we may have had 2 preschool classrooms across the district, the whole district. It was 1 or 2. It was a smaller number. And so that requirement has changed. We're going to talk about requirements that have changed with RTI, Tennessee All-Core, things that have changed in how we're using the facilities. So Mr. Cathy and myself actually went out and walked the schools. You have maps of the schools there. You also have charts that say how the different rooms are being used in both the modulars and the main buildings themselves. Do we have maps with this also? Yes, they're in the back of the packet. I just handed it out. Okay, great. So with that, I'll let Mr. Cathy take over and start talking about some of these spaces. And we'll also talk about demographers report, some of the projections that we've had. We'll talk about those spaces.
Okay, so we'll start with Farmington. Good evening, and then we'll move over to Dogwood. But I think I'll start with the why tonight. Why are we having this discussion? As the board is aware, the board requested this. The board is also aware that we spend roughly $180,000 each year on modular lease payments for the buildings that are at Farmington and Dogwood. We have 8 classrooms at Dogwood that are modular, 6 at Farmington. And so we really looked at every space, every nook and cranny of each of these schools. As Mr. Manuel said, we went and did building walks with the principals of each school to look at that space and how it's being utilized along with the portables. So in the packet that I just handed out to you, you've got a chart that kind of goes over each space and what it's being used for. You've also got maps if you're more visual and like to follow along with the map. And I'll just take you through some of the kind of the highlights and the conclusions. But as Mr. Manuel touched on, we put these modulars in when we were operating around 900 students at Farmington and Dogwood prior to the construction of Forest Hill. We're operating closer to 600 now. The whole story there, yes, we have decreased in students. We've also had some programmatic changes over the years, as Mr. Manuel pointed out. We're very proud of the fact that we now have thriving preschool programs at each one of our schools, and those students are able to attend the school that they're zoned to. But that took space. We have 2 preschool sections operating at each school now, so those are 2 classrooms that we needed that we didn't need before at Dogwood. We've also expanded our voluntary pre-K program. We've added part-time music and art teachers, and those teachers had to have space to be housed. We've expanded our RTI program, and then we've added TN All-Core. So as you're aware, we've expanded some programs that have required some spaces to be used. The student populations now at Farmington Dogwood are very similar. At Farmington, so these are broken down into 4 charts, 4 sections. At Farmington, the first section that you'll see is for regular classroom instruction. As the board is aware, we're required by BEP to staff at a certain level for each grade. For kindergarten through 3rd grade, that is a 1-to-20 ratio. So I only point that out to say that right now, currently at Farmington, if you look at that first chart, we have 32 classrooms that are dedicated to K through 5 instruction. That could change next year. If we get a big kindergarten class that comes in, or we get transfers that come in, we'll need additional classrooms. So that's not a static number. Again, for K through 3, we have to staff at 1-to-20 with no classroom with a maximum of more than 25. And then for 4th through 5th grade, we have to have an average of 25 in that grade band with no one classroom with a maximum size of more than 30. So again, at Farmington, 32 of our rooms are K through 5 instruction this year for our student population. The next section that you see is exceptional student education instruction. And so if you look at how that breaks out, we've got 3 classrooms that are dedicated to preschool. We've got our ESL, that's our English as second language learners. We've got gifted instruction that takes place. We've got our ESE speech and speech pathologists. And if you flip over to the back of that first sheet, we've also got OTPT. We've got a blue/sensory room, and then we've got our specialized instruction classrooms, 2 of them. So 10 total classrooms at Farmington dedicated to specialized instruction. And then we have our other spaces. So we have a space at Farmington dedicated to our Tennessee All-Core tutoring program. We have a space dedicated to STEM and art instruction. We have another space dedicated just to art instruction. And then we have a technology space for our instructional technology coach and systems technology support and all of the stuff that comes with technology. And then the last section here is how the portables are currently being used. Currently out in the portables, 2 of those portable classrooms are being used for our guidance counselors. We have our homebound instruction teacher in one of those modular classrooms. And then on your last sheet, we've got 2 classrooms out in the modulars that are dedicated to music, and then 1 that is dedicated to gifted. That is currently how the space is being used at Farmington. Now, when we looked at this and we really tried to look at how could we consolidate this, would it be possible to just pick up those classrooms that are out in the modulars, and we'll have the similar discussion at Dogwood. But we said, yeah, there are some efficiencies that we think that we could find there, and some, but we don't think we could comfortably fit those 6 classrooms into the space.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Manuel.
And I think some of the challenges that we faced, like I talked about, for example, when we had our preschool sections, as you know, we're required to provide special education preschool for our students, and a lot of those come through TEIS. From when they turn 3, they can come and receive services from us. Our Department of Education identified us and said that we almost have to have a 1-to-1 ratio of typical peers in those classrooms with those students, and so they're fully mainstreamed in those classes. So that really increased our number of sections. And like Mr. Cathy said, we almost have 2 sections at each of our schools. We know that there's Farmington, I think, is expanding into next year into that second section based on the numbers that they're seeing coming up for next year. So that's one of those challenges that we face. RTI is another one that we see. When we have that RTI period, you're breaking into smaller groups. So you have teachers and staff that in one classroom, you may have a class of 20 students, but when we break into the RTI section, you may be leaving 10 students in one classroom, pulling 5 to a different section, 3 to a different section. So that's why we have to have those additional spaces there. So the big rubber, when the rubber hits the road, when we talk about what our recommendation is, and it's going to be for both of the campuses, we do believe that we need additional classroom spaces in these schools based on how they're using these spaces. And we really tried to really take a hard knife and say, could we just completely get rid of them and pull them off the campuses? We don't believe that we could do that and serve our students without putting individuals on carts, floating into sections. That's something we could do, but I don't think that's something that we strive to do. So our recommendation, and it's not something that we're asking the board to vote on tonight, my recommendation would be for the board to go with us to these facilities and to the modulars, and then we think it would be good for new board members too to go around and tour the schools and see these. We did this with Mr. Curry at one time also, and Mr. Strain. We think it would be good for y'all to do that, but our request will be to look into some type of brick and mortar expansions at both Dogwood and Farmington. They would be smaller. What we're recommending is putting the brand that we see at Riverdale and at Houston Middle School and at Forest Hill onto those campuses. So we thought how best to do that. The challenge with Farmington right now, for example, when we think about music rooms, there's not a dedicated music room. And you can hear what's happening in the classroom right next to you. So if you think about putting a music room into an academic hallway, that's a challenge and a struggle for us. So one of the things we're recommending doing at both the schools, but of course this would be our request to the board, and we would have to change our 5-year plan of how to do this. We would ask that we add a music room onto each of the schools. An art room like you see at Riverdale, like you see at Forest Hill. You think about what our brand is for that type of space. And then a room that could be both, because we do have itinerant teachers that float between the schools. So adding those 3 instructional spaces, smaller little additions that could be stuck onto the buildings. But then we also talk about the need at both of the spaces for smaller spaces. When you think about at Dogwood, for example, they have half classrooms that could be used for smaller instruction like RTI, could be used for speech services, could be used for smaller groups in both of those locations. So that would be something that we would be requesting, and we would want the board to let us go out and investigate what this would look like, come back with a recommendation of how many square feet, what we would do before we would remove these modulars at each of the locations. Mr. Cathy, sorry, I went on about Farmington.
I think you covered it well, sir.
Are there questions about like how we see it used, or questions about the programs that are in this chart, or specifics about any of these uses?
Only question, so you've got 2 music rooms in the modulars at Farmington. You think 1 music room of an addition would be enough?
Yeah, so when we talk about what we want to add 1 music room that we would be pulling there. But with the other space, and they have this space at Forest Hill, for example, we have itinerant, they have part-time art and part-time music at both places. You could use a space that is designed for both. If you have one that actually has sinks but also has sound control in the same room, we could use it for those itinerants. So really we're asking music, art, and then a combo room.
Mr. Cathy, how old are the portables, or I would say modular rooms at Farmington? Because I know when we toured it, they seem dated to me compared to what Dogwood had.
We put them in at the same time at both schools, but we added 2 additional classrooms on at Dogwood as Dogwood continued to grow. But they went in at the same time. I believe we're on year 7 or 8 of operating them.
Yeah, I know walking in Farmington's, they seemed, like I said, compared to walking into the Dogwoods, and I don't know if it's the same, it could have been a different manufacturer. It just felt, when I walked in, it felt more worn there, and it could be where they have more traffic in and out of them at Farmington, and that might be, definitely when we do our site tour, I think you'll probably get the same impression. I feel the ones at Dogwood, they at least feel newer.
Two of them are newer at Dogwood. So when we look at this, like I said, our recommendation is to investigate putting something smaller onto the schools to deal with the growing needs, while also then removing those modulars.
So as we're looking at this, and I was one of the board members that voted for having the modulars. Again, the mindset was this would be temporary because we were at 900 kids per school, and I also lived through that process as well. I'm still struggling with 300 fewer students and needing more classrooms. And I get that there have been programmatic changes, particularly with the preschool. I'm still kind of processing that a little bit, because I know what we made do with previously, and I don't want to make do. I want our kids to have what they need.
Right. So that's why I said that the challenge is we found ways that we could get close to just removing the portables and do that, but that means that you would be putting itinerant art and music on carts going into classrooms. You would be putting counselors no longer having spaces going into classrooms. We may have to combine multiple groups of instructions, like use dividers in rooms to have 4 different groups of students working with staff. It could be done, but wouldn't be to what we would recommend.
So when you're looking at the timeline of, because again, we're talking $180,000 a year, how much longer if we're going to put brick and mortar in? And if we're going to do that, are we looking at, what I would like for you to look at is not just what'll cover us for now, but if we're going to do this, what'll cover us beyond now, right? So
we believe we have a real
growth.
Yes, we believe we have a real conservative and use for that space. Like we think that it's going
Right.
to be a good plan. But like I said, I think that's where it would be really helpful for the board to get their eyes on that, do tours of the facilities, and see how those spaces are being used, and then we can talk about what do we want to do versus not do.
Okay.
Yeah, by putting this space on, you keep people off of carts. You keep
Right, and it's
yep.
for me, it's a safety issue. It really is. I mean, there comes a point where the kids being in those spaces for classroom space. If we had an active shooter situation, or we had, they're not as locked down as a brick and mortar would be, and I want that addressed. And I think if this is the way we need to do it, it's the way we need to do it. Again, it's that I have to wrap my mind around the fact that I know what 900 kids in the building without the portables look like. And I don't want to go back to that. But we have 300 fewer kids in each school. So I'm still needing to wrap my head around that.
Is the reason to talk about this now more of a kind of structural integrity of the buildings decreasing over time, or a cost of maintenance going up? Or?
It's just the fact that we have continued to pay. We moved into this leasing, and the board's intention was to not have these permanently here, and it's always something we have just kicked the can down the road and said, oh, we'll address that later. Well, we need to, like Ms. Ove said, we need to make sure that we move out of that temporary world into a permanent world and decide what we need to do moving forward. And so the recommendation is, I think we all say, we don't want to live in that modular world and make sure we have those. We want to make sure moving forward, we're providing for all the services and programs in the school, but if we're going to do that with a brick and mortar. But it's not like they're falling down and we have to get rid of them.
It's just we've been paying, $180,000 a year for 7 or 8 years, which at this point
Would have paid for the brick and mortar.
Yeah.
Correct.
I mean, I want to do the site inspection and all that, but I don't really see a need to wait to move to the next step of trying to get pricing or something like that until we've already done that. I mean, I think we're not going to really be able to make a decision on this until we know all of that information. So, but I think we should still do the site visits. But
I agree. If you want to go ahead and proceed with some of the exploration of cost and site and all that stuff, that's fine. in my opinion. If
We're going to do, like I said, our goal is to now do in the next 2
Side by
months. So
side,
first
yeah.
step was to do an analysis of how we're using the spaces, which we've given you. I think next step for us is to say, okay, let's do analysis of what would it take to make them the way that we want to make them.
I think that, as Board Member Ove said, it's, the security has been something that's been brought up repeatedly, but also just that we've reached a point where the expense of a lease, we're kind of at a jumping off place that we need to start putting it in, that those funds, in my opinion, into something that is gonna be ours. So, sounds like we're, have the study, which is exactly what, was requested, and we have a better working knowledge of the utilization of inside the building and in the modulars, and now we can, start to look at what our options are as far as construction that could replace some of that.
Mr. Cathy, you want to move on to Dogwood?
Anything else on Farmington before we move to Dogwood?
I did have a question. When you were saying half classrooms, I was trying to. Yes. Okay, yeah.
So they're smaller rooms at the end of each of the hallways, and they're very effective for smaller uses. Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
but you can't put full classes into those.
Farmington doesn't have them,
That's
but
what-
Dogwood has one.
That's right,
2,
okay.
3, 4 at the end of each hall.
That's, I've been there on occasion. Okay, that's what I was wondering. Thank you for that. Even that's better than a cart.
Well, the spaces at Dogwood, those half classrooms, they give the ability to put something like a TNL core or a smaller group that doesn't need a full dedicated space, where you can use those smaller spaces, but it frees up a full space in order for you to be able to use that for something else. So they do help. I'll take you through Dogwood's utilization, and it makes sense. You had 32 regular classroom instruction K through 5. At Farmington, you have 32 at Dogwood because the student populations are very similar this year. So those match. For our ESE or specialized instruction classrooms, it's a little different because of the half rooms at Dogwood, but you've got your preschool, where 2 dedicated spaces. So your specialized instruction, you've got 2.5 there. So there's the half classroom coming into play. You've got a half classroom that's ESE a sensory room. You've got one that's dedicated to speech, one for OTPT, 2 for gifted instruction, half of a classroom for the ESE homebound instruction, and then I'm flipping over to the back. That gives you a total of 8 full-size classroom and 3 half classrooms being utilized for specialized instruction at Dogwood. And then we get into the other spaces. So we have one space being utilized for music instruction, one for a teacher workroom and classroom assistance, 2 for art instruction, 1 for general ed RTI and TNL core, 2 for guidance, and then we have a half room at the end that's being utilized for kiln, and 1 that's for technology, again, instructional technology coach, systems and technology support, and all of the gear that comes and devices that come with that. And then out into the portables, they're currently using one as a PLC teacher room / conference room. They're using one for TNL core tutoring, the ELA specifically, 1 for our goal interventionist and for testing, 1 for our TNL core tutoring math program, 1 for string / orchestra, 1 for our RTI and intervention, 1 for music, and then the last one is for ESL. So they've got a total of 8 modulars at Dogwood. And with that, we can begin the discussion or any questions that are specific to Dogwood.
Could you go through that again with the portables? So we have the PLC room in P1, and P2 is labeled Turner. What is that?
P2 is the TNL core program, so that's our tutoring program.
Right.
So every hour they're rotating, groups of students in for tutoring.
Yeah. And then 3 is
3 is being used by GOAL. That's our interventionist that works with the GOAL program. And then if they have to do state testing or bring students in person, that's the classroom that they have dedicated to that.
okay.
So like I said, there are rooms that we can go, like that's one, for example, that we can say, yeah, we could
Yeah,
reduce
I'm
that
just
space.
trying to, again, because I don't have names that I associate
Yes.
specifically with. And P4,
Is being used for the T and all core programs, specifically the
Also?
math tutoring.
okay,
P5 is being used for strings and orchestra. So that's Mr.
Okay.
Smith, I believe.
Smith, right, and RTI is P6.
RTI is P6,
And
and then
there's a second RTI, but one inside and one outside,
Correct. There's
Okay.
multiple RTI groups.
okay?
Mr. Brookshire is in P7 for music,
Music, okay.
and then ESL, English as a second language, is in the 8th modular
Thank you.
classroom.
I just wanted to put subjects with names. Thank you.
So then for something like in music, Mr. Brookshire, P7, now he goes between schools.
He does. He is actually shared between, if memory serves, 3 schools, where he is part-time, 2 days at Dogwood, 2 days at Farmington, and 1 at Forest Hill, if memory serves correctly.
And then with P5 being where the orchestra goes for the amount of string sections, I guess, for the elementary level. And I know that they probably need to be set up differently.
Yeah, the challenge with the music teachers is they just come with a lot of stuff. Yeah, instruments.
He's got a lot of awesome stuff.
But could there be some efficiencies there where we looked at the part-time and looked at ways to combine space? Yeah, we think there could be. But the challenge with the music teachers is just the sheer amount of instruments and gear that they come with.
And Smith is part-time here too. He travels too, is that correct? Because he's not there all day.
Smith Orchestra, not Smith
Orchestra.
Music.
I'm sorry, I thought you were talking about the music teacher.
No, I'm sorry, not Joseph Smith, T. Smith.
That's correct. He is not there full-time. He is there part-time.
And of course, the all-core, both the ELA and the math having their own space. That's relatively new.
So if we were to add brick and mortar here, what are the thoughts here?
Same recommendation. I think when we think about what we could do with our fine arts programs, that we would have something comparable at all of the schools as far as a music room, an art room, a combination for those itinerant teachers that they're alternating days that they're working, and then 2 half spaces for either small group instruction, tutoring, those types of spaces.
I'm going to be referring to the master facilities plan here. So just, I realize everyone might not have it handy, so I'll just kind of read through a couple of key points. So Dogwood has 88,000 square feet, and if my math is right, 51 and a half classrooms. The plan says 52, so I guess we'll just use 52 there. So 52 with 88,000 square feet, and then Farmington is 73,908 with 46 classrooms, right? But the exact same number of students. So to me, I think if we had to prioritize, I think Farmington would be the most critical need. Just there's already 15,000 square feet smaller and already 6 classrooms smaller. Farmington serving the same number of students. And so I guess just to kind of inform our discussions as we go forward, I'm not mitigating the need at Dogwood, but I don't know how it would work with the portables, but if we had to keep one in portables longer than the other, I think Farmington would be the one that we would need to address first and foremost, unless I'm missing something.
Well,
Agreed.
I'm looking at, I mean, you're looking at this portable at Dogwood, and the majority are part-time use of the rooms, half at least. Whereas in Farmington's, that's not the case. Pretty much, all of them are kind of part-time use to an extent. So yeah, I concur with that, Mr. Curry. I think Farmington's is more pressing.
And it could be where at Dogwood there is a need to add some brick and mortar, but I think it would be a much smaller project than Farmington, where I think Farmington we're going to have to add some pretty significant square footage. I mean, we would add 15,000 just to get it on par with Farmington, and I don't know if that's necessary. I don't know. Mr. Kathy, how many square foot on average for a classroom?
Are we talking about square foot dollar amount?
No, just in general, just size-wise.
Oh, size-wise. So and generally 800 for a regular ed classroom, but usually with our arts and our music, we go a little bigger than that. It's just a hair over 1,000 square feet, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,100, depending on footprint.
So even if we were to add, I don't know, let's just say, and obviously there's hallways and stuff you have to consider, but if we were to add 8 classrooms at Farmington brick and mortar, I don't think we would still equal the brick and mortar square footage that exists at Dogwood.
That's correct.
Well, but we'd still just be looking at adding 3 classrooms at each. I think you just have smaller classroom sizes at Farmington than you do at Dogwood.
There's some change. Yeah, there's some differences in the sizes of the classrooms. Also, too, if you think about the hallways at Farmington compared to Dogwood, there's a dramatic difference.
So it wouldn't, even after, I think is what you're saying, even after we, if we built out both of them, Farmington would still be roughly the same size difference that it is now.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that comes to mind for Farmington, for me, I know we've got the demographer study. I do think that Farmington is going to be the area with Glasgow, the country club. I do think Farmington is going to be the area that's going to experience the most growth. We don't know how significant the number is, but I do think there will be some growth in the Farmington area, and I think being prepared with some brick and mortar, I think, is the right way to go there. Obviously cost-wise, and at some point we'll look to see. I will say that I think given where these would be on the campus, I understand doing our brand, but I don't think we need to be going for any architectural awards here. I think it's something to blend in with the light wells are nice, but I don't know if that's what we necessarily need to do here. I think we're going for maximizing our dollars. So. I love the light wells, by the way.
I was going to say, I thought that was the brand standard.
But
Don't tell our
in the
architect
back,
friends that
in
you're
the
not
back
looking
of
to get
Farmington, I don't know that the light wells are really going to give us what we're looking for.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out, and we point it out every time we do a tour of our older buildings. The majority of those classrooms that are being used for specialty spaces, music, art, STEM, they weren't designed for that. That wasn't the original intent of the design. We're using just classrooms that were designed to do regular education instruction in those spaces. So just being able to design something on the front end with it in mind of it being an art classroom or a music classroom, will be well out ahead of the game on that.
Does Farmington not have a kiln room, or am I just missing that? Okay, are they the only school without that? Okay. And then one question about the lease. What is the term of our lease? Like, is there a point where we would have to renegotiate that, or price could potentially go up?
I think we're in the year-to-year phase.
It is on a year-to-year basis, and yes, there is the possibility that they could do cost increases on us.
And who do we lease our modulars from?
The name of the company is Mobile Modular.
Okay.
Yeah, we did a bid package. Gosh, Miss Oaf could probably tell you better than me. I think 2015 we did a bid package for those modulars that are still there today.
Okay.
I'm gonna say I do think we need to be careful with these projects, because as I'm listening to this, I get kind of nervous. I see other projects, the timelines moving way down the road, and it's I think we have to consider that to super optimize these spaces to get ahead of the times while other spaces are already behind the times. That's also, I think we need to make
Where
sure
do you go to
we
school,
do
Mr. Alferman?
I have
You wouldn't be talking about Houston High School, would you?
Oh no.
I have similar concerns. It's.
I mean, as someone who represents the students, we sit, my biology class, we're crammed 30 plus people into this tiny little room, and we're talking about adding on rooms for part-time, and it's it's great, but I think we need to make sure that we're across the student body optimizing our spending.
Yes, that's part of the timing when we talk about our projects and making sure, and prioritization. That's all really important for us too.
I would also say, you brought up the build out from the city. And we don't know what the impact's gonna be. But we also, if it is big enough, we could have the Z word that we have to address at some point that is not, I know you don't wanna go through that. I've been through that. But it's not popular, but it is something that can be addressed that way. And that is a little more cost effective. Maybe not politically,
No, and
but monetarily.
I just feel like if we take away the modulars from Farmington, I think we're going to owe them space. I don't think there's any disputing that. Again, based on the square footages, the sheer number of classrooms that are already existing inside the brick and mortar at Farmington. Again, given the equal amount of students, there's 6 more classrooms at Dogwood with the same amount of students. So I'm sensitive to making sure that, because again, I don't want to be throwing away money in a lease for modulars, but I do think that if we decided as a board to do away with those, I think we would owe Farmington that space.
Did the demographers take into account that development when they did those numbers, or did they know that was
The second time, but also too, when you look at, we'll get into demographers. Yep. Actually, if we want to go ahead and show, we can project it. So can you go to the school by school? I think you said you had that slide. There aren't dramatic changes that you have in numbers, and a lot of times those are absorbed within the grade band. So instead of having a class of 17, you may go to a class of 18 or 19. You know, those things grow within the classroom, not necessarily a brick and mortar change there. But you can see the peak for Dogwood there. See if you can go to Farmington. So you can see Farmington 2 stays around those same numbers, still under 650, I think, in all the grade bands that you have there. And the reason for that, when we talked about how the students and how families actually move in, you don't have families moving out of, even though they're matriculating up, going from one grade band to the other. You have families that live within Farmington zone, and they have moved on up to Houston Middle School, or they move on up to the high school. Their house is not available then for another family to come in and live in that Farmington zone. Same thing too. The demographer talked about the fact that when people's children graduate from high school, they don't automatically say, okay, we're done with Germantown, it's time to leave. A lot of our residents stay here even when their children have moved on and they've graduated and they're working in other places. Some of them have coming back. They said the number one driving factor of when a family decides to leave a house in Germantown is when one of the spouses dies. And that's when they typically downsize what they see within cities. And so that's why they use mortality rates to predict people moving out of the area. So and we're fairly confident. The demographer has been really close. I think in the past 8 years that we've had it, it's been within, 5 to 7 students, a really tight prediction. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be changes that happen. He always says it's a forecast. It's not a prediction, a crystal ball where he can tell exactly, because interest rates change things. All kinds of things can impact this evaluation.
Yeah, I remember specifically he said, now this was back in January, and he said that interest rate of 4.5 would potentially change the forecast, and we blew by that. And so we're up around 6 to 7 now. So and I think we're seeing the impact of that locally. So we'll have to see how close he is as we go forward.
Another thing we've seen when we were looking at the studies, like if you take a number of houses and say there are 100 houses, I think what we found was about a third of those houses will be filled with school-aged children within our district, because you have other people who may send their children to private school, they may homeschool, you have people without children. So we typically see about a third of the houses having families in them. Then you take that third of the houses, so let's say 33 houses out of that 100. Of those houses, you got to spread those out amongst each of the grade bands, because you have some in the elementary school, some in the middle, some in the high school. So it dilutes the impact on schools when we look at numbers of houses. Other questions on demographers, numbers at each of these schools?
Actually, yeah, one more thing. So, do we have numbers somewhere on, like, in each of these kind of specialty classes, like how many kids are in there at any given time?
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's one of the things that we look at when we try to compress, and the reason we recommend these, we can't compress those. So even if you talk about somebody that's coming in, even though they're part-time, I may have a part-time teacher that's 2 days. They may be part-time where they're using that space 2 days of the week, every single period of the day, or an art teacher that's coming in 3 days and they're in that space all 3 periods. So that's the challenge that we have with
I was
those
thinking
numbers.
more along the lines of like how Dogwood has the half classrooms, like seeing if that would be an option at Farmington.
Well, it is, but it isn't for the spaces that we're recommending there. So when we talk about music spaces, art spaces, we really struggled, and we actually took a really, and we're going to allow y'all to do that too. See, it would be very difficult to compress those classes unless, like I said, if you're willing to say, hey, we're going to have a music teacher that floats into around the music classes, or an art teachers, if you think about the type of lesson they could provide there, it becomes very difficult, or guidance for that example. It could be done, but I think the goal here is to say, what is our objective for the district? What is our exemplar? How do we want to provide those types of instruction? So yeah, we could definitely, we could cut these spaces. That's why we're not saying at Dogwood, for example, we need 8 spaces. At Farmington, we're not saying we need 6 spaces. We can really reduce that number by looking at those.
Well, and I mean, to Mr. Opperman's point, if we wanted to add some half classrooms as well to Farmington, in addition, we could potentially move something that's in a larger classroom in the building into a half space into the new building. You know, whether that's, I don't know, a speech person, if they're, I don't know. I'm just.
We talked about the challenges that we have for
spitballing
at
for
Farmington,
that.
for example. Like we have 2 speech pathologists in the same room, and so they've divided the room, and they're actually
Right.
serving different groups of students. So we've already done those games.
If we potentially had 2 half classrooms that we added on in our new construction, let's say, that would free up a classroom in building that would be a full-size classroom.
Correct, but that's one of those
Some
challenges.
I think those are some decisions that will have to be kind of
Most
looked at.
definitely.
Are there any other questions regarding the modular spaces discussion at this time? I appreciate the exercise, Mr. Kathy, and I love a map. You know I'm visual, and I think talking about being consistent but also prioritizing the need, you know, it's not like we just go, poof, all the modulars are gone at both schools, because the needs and the enrollment and the utilization of them now is different, as we've seen. So it looks like we're taking a lot of things into consideration, but I think we've all decided that we really want to move towards, you know, financially something that's going to belong to us and not be something that we continue to lease. So thank you. Anything else? That's all right. We've come a long way in the modular department. No further questions. That takes us to agenda item number 3, which is the discussion on 3G schools agreement.
And Chairman, due to my employer and law firm's representation of Memphis Shelby County Schools, I'm going to recuse myself from discussion on this, and I'll step outside until y'all signal me to come back in.
Thank you so much, Board Member Strain. Noted. wants to.
As you, do you want me to lead this, or do you?
No, please go ahead and start the party.
As you're aware, this has been a discussion that has been occurring between Mayor Palazzolo. I think he was meeting with Mayor Harris, representatives of Shelby County Schools, and they have been discussing the settlement agreement that's before you. I think you're also aware that the mayor and aldermen have voted on this agreement. Same for Shelby County Commission yesterday, and I believe that Shelby County Schools was earlier today, undergoing the same action. So now it's before this board. As you're aware, this is something that y'all have looked at, and I'm sure if y'all have questions, Ms. Estes, we could have any further questions. We could discuss those or concerns at this time.
I guess based on your comments just now, I want to make clear that what we are considering is the same as the other bodies that you just described. There's no variations. This is all uniform writing that has been as a culmination of back and forth between all parties that are, tasked with considering it. And we just happen to be the last ones to consider it. Are there any particular questions specific to the settlement at this time? And then I wanted to point out as well, we do have a resolution format of this agreement that was, I believe, part of the requirement, the way the statute read, that we would have to kind of have it just in this documented format as well as the draft, that a lot of whereases, but just for clarification purposes.
That's correct. So I think the state law specifies that it has to be accomplished through a resolution of the board. And so our legal counsel took the city's resolution and just tailored it to us. So if there was something specific about the resolution that you want to discuss, we could also do that.
So would we, in the course of the business meeting, would we be voting to approve the resolution or approving the agreement?
It's both. The resolution gives the authority to the board chair and superintendent to execute this agreement. So it is the agreement.
So should this resolution pass,
Yes, if the resolution passes, you're executing the.
we are executing the agreement
That's correct.
at that time?
That's correct. And that is not typical for this board, as you know. Typically, this board says we're approving the contract itself, but the state law, for some reason, was prescriptive that it has to be done by resolution.
Ms. Estes, I know we can't make any changes here, but what would your suggestion be for us to pursue an MOU with the city for Germantown Middle and Germantown Elementary and the disposition, however it ends up going, let's say 9 years from now? I know we've got in there that it would be transferred, but I feel that there's an opportunity for us to reach an MOU with the city. What would your suggestion be on how to best proceed with that?
That is something that's obvious or clearly outside the scope of this agreement, but I think the city of Germantown would welcome that this body and those governing the city of Germantown would welcome resolution as to the ultimate use of those facilities. And I think this particular board would be very successful in serving its students along those lines.
Okay, thank you.
Would that not potential, and though this is not what we're deciding now, would that not potentially hamstring future boards in a decision to be made 9 years from now as opposed to now?
That's one of the considerations you would need to guard either against, or if you wanted to tie it up, ensure that it's in there. But that would be something that this board would determine, just like any of the other things that y'all consider. Is, y'all are always, how many times do we hear the people at this table say, we want to make sure this is where we want to be 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And so I'm fully confident that this board would take into account any long-term agreements on the future for the school district.
Mr. Manuel, do you have the Houston High School projected numbers from the demographer by chance, or are they available?
Yes, we can pull those up. So you can see, as you're aware, Houston High School is built for 2,000 students. We typically run about 1,700 resident students at that school, and other students come in through the academies at Houston High School. As you're aware, we have 3 academies. We have an honors academy, we have a fine arts academy, and we have a leadership academy there at the school. So they account for about 300 of those 2,000 students. Although I think right now, as of today, I think we're sitting at 1940 for the number of students at the high school. So it's a much smaller number. But know that even looking at those numbers, we do not peak over that 2,000 student number for the students at that school.
Okay, yeah, and so I'm trying to think. That was started in 19, so we're 22. So 9 years from now, enrollment, well, if we're looking at that, we're actually looking at an enrollment drop compared to where we are today, about 100 students.
That's correct. And like I said, that's one of those things that we control through our academy usage so that we optimize the use of that facility.
And the reason I point that out, I know Germantown High School in particular is a pretty sensitive issue in the city, but looking at the numbers that we have, we're not projecting a massive increase in the number of high school students. I don't see a scenario where we would have the number of students in Germantown available to split between 2 high schools unless you were to drop way down in student population, which would then it would negatively impact the course offerings. There would be a lot that I think people, when they look at Houston High School, I don't know if it's really appreciated what we're able to offer given the student population that we have. And to cut that in half, I think, would reduce the number of AP courses. It would reduce your fine arts offerings, CTE. I think, yeah, there would be a lot of negative to what we currently offer, which I think is something that I know I'm personally very proud of, and I know our district's proud of what we're able to offer there at the high school. So, when I look at this agreement, I look at the high school as something that, while again I understand it, when I look from a fiscal standpoint and, just kind of the big picture, I just don't see where the high school would fit into what we're trying to, where we're trying to position ourselves as a district.
That's correct, and we've talked about the fact that how do we optimize course offerings programs. We think that the high school is designed very efficiently, but also allowing those services. I would not recommend running schools with that low a population because you couldn't have all those things that I think we've become accustomed to.
And I guess the last question, and you've mentioned this in the past, I just want to make sure for the scope of this discussion, I know there's a fixed cost just to open up a school. What is that number? And I guess if it were at the high school, would that number be higher for a high school versus elementary? What's your math on how much it would cost?
It is higher, but we talk about it's rough numbers because you have utility costs that when you run an additional school, you have additional utility. You got to think about those. Even though you have the same number of students, you would have administration for each of those facilities. You would have librarians, you would have counselors, you would have additional positions that would be of those schools. So typically we say about $1 million is what it takes. And there is a difference between high school, so it could be higher than that for a high school if we were to split and have that, but that would not be our recommendation.
And then do we have today a rough idea? I guess we'll just focus on the middle school and the elementary school. Do we have a rough idea of the deferred maintenance for each of those at this point?
For the facilities that we were discussing?
Yeah, for elementary and middle.
For Germantown Elementary, Middle, and High School, yes, when we looked at the FCIs, and we had older documentation for the FCIs, were a struggle. They were below, I think it was 0.5 or 500, how you look at it, to the point that it may be helpful to, if you're talking about bringing up to our standard or bringing up to code, that some of the buildings would have to be demolished or sections of them would. So the FCIs were very low in those buildings.
Are there any other questions at this time? Is there any desire to kind of get a little quick, brief history or kind of a recap as to what actually is in this document? I think that if we're going to talk about it publicly, or if anyone would like to speak to just their, I guess, personal thoughts on it. For me personally, I think it's important to note that these negotiations took place, as I think was previously mentioned, with our city leadership and the county leadership, both elected mayors and Memphis Shelby County Schools. And that everyone came to a consensus that they were looking to serve current students that are attending these schools. I think we all know the history, but for the public record, the reason that this urgency has been presented now is as a result of the law that was passed back in May earlier this year. So after several get-togethers from the parties I just mentioned, a draft started to become a living document that was back and forth. I think we all know and where we have ended up. For me personally, considering the students, families, and staff of the current schools was a big factor, as was all parties, primarily us, because that's what I'm tasked to do, is avoid litigation. Those are two of the biggest points for me in this agreement that I feel like got everyone to a place where, as I'm considering it personally in my capacity, best interest of students. Not only students today, but students down the road. I was able to listen to the majority of the discussion with the Shelby County Commission as they discussed it yesterday. Their lens of looking at this and their task was a little different, although it was approved. They are the fiscal body that has to decide how they're going to come up with the funds that are spelled out here in 2 fiscal years for a major undertaking of constructing a new high school, which would serve the majority of students in their geographic residential areas that are currently zoned for Germantown High School, my understanding. Any questions up to this point on that? I'm kind of speaking specific to the high school and kind of how that has been separated and what has been offered in this agreement to, I guess, address that.
I concur with you that the focus, I think, for me in this is somewhat twofold. One is the students. Are the students and staff of the 3Gs being taken care of? And I feel like with the agreement of the county commission stepping in and providing the funding to construct a brand new high school in the geographic location so they can have a neighborhood school is a step definitely in the right direction for those students and hopefully for the staff as well. And the fact that it's a 9-year rollout gives time for students to finish where they are, for the current students, and for them to have the time to design and build an appropriate replacement. Now, on the side of us, how does this impact us? I think when you made your comments earlier about how this document came to be, the initial discussions were the city government of Germantown, the county mayor, and Memphis and Shelby County schools, correct?
Yes, that's our understanding as far as the
Right.
negotiations.
As far as our understanding is, because we were brought in at the tail end. I think that's also important to note. Just for information's purposes. The other side of it, like you said, the fact it avoids litigation is good. I also appreciate, for all three schools, that if certain things happen, for example, after the 9 years for Germantown Middle and Germantown Elementary, and the payment from the city, $5 million, those titles would come to us, and then we would have the option at that time, if we need them for the students, to use them to use those properties for the students of Germantown Municipal School District. We have the demographic reports, we have the projections, but it is nice to know, should something change and we need that space, we have the option, or the board of the future potentially could have that option of using those facilities such as they are. But again, go back to, there's still that 9-year time to make sure that the children who are currently in those buildings are able to be served in those buildings until they're on, unless Memphis Shelby County Schools decides otherwise, that's in their purview and not ours at that point.
I think that's worth noting as well, that the transition timeline that's available in this document is lengthy, but it also does, as you were saying, does provide for an amount of notice, I believe 6 months, from the Memphis Shelby County Schools would be operating these schools if this agreement is accepted. And so they would continue to do that. And then that would be their responsibility to communicate at which point in time prior to that timeline that they may want to adjust or, exit.
And that is their purview.
Absolutely. That's
right.
Not us.
Not us. So I'm as comfortable, I think, as I'm going to be with this agreement. Since we are kind of in a position where there's a law in place, and it's either, we reach an agreement that's acceptable to all parties, or we face dealing with the law coming into effect fully.
Yeah, and I want to clarify a couple things, because as I watched the county commission yesterday, and as I've seen kind of reported, I'm looking at the law right now. No student was going to be displaced in 2023 from Germantown. That just wasn't going to happen. Matter of fact, the settlement actually is a less of a horizon than what was provided for in state law. State law said that you could have had up to a total of 12 years of transition. And so this agreement is actually less than what was spelled out in the state law. So I know, and I don't know if it was just people not reading the law or whatever happened there, but I do think that there was some unnecessary panic in the community that people were going to be thrown out on the street in July 1st of 2023, and that just was never going to be the case, and the law was very clear on that. So I feel like that's an important distinction to make, and I will probably make that as well during the business meeting to kind of reinforce that point. I think it's going to be important for our residents to know it is status quo. If this agreement passes, nothing changes. So I know from talking to parents that live in the Germantown Park area, they were concerned that they would not be going to the schools that they currently attend. I can tell you the families who I've personally talked to that attend Forest Hill, they don't want to leave Forest Hill under any way, any shape, form, or fashion, nor do the families that are zoned for Riverdale in that area. They don't want to leave Riverdale. And so I think, again, we need to make sure our residents know that nothing changes. It is status quo. And if SCS decides they need it for 9 years, then we're status quo for 9 years. And then at that point, then the board at that time will assess what is needed and what's not, and decisions will be made. But no one is going to get moved next fall to Germantown Elementary, because they're not our schools and won't be until said time. So I think, again, clarification for the community, because I know different things have been said. And I think it's important that we're operating under the facts in this situation.
I also want to point out that because of some media coverage and either perception of what some people in the community may have understood it to say, or maybe how it was presented, these aren't our schools to sell. They're Memphis-Shelby County schools to sell. And I think that's something that really needs to be reminded. This isn't our transaction. We happen to be last because of the calendar, the group to be considering this, but based on the law, the parties that are set up to make a transaction, that's the existing school district, and this is a long-range plan for transition. And there is a significant amount of funding involved, like I said earlier, to address the high school needs in the community where the students, a large portion of the students, happen to reside. Again, we don't fund our own major new construction. Certainly, no other school districts. So that's again that's out of our purview and scope as well. What we're looking at here is, in my mind, is to agree to allow these things to take place in the future. And then I think that in Section 6, we make a point as a result of, this is a great opportunity for our board, and we're going to be talking about this a lot in the next several months. I have a feeling, even just with this modular discussion a moment ago, construction and how funds are used, whether it be renovations, expansions like we just did at Houston Middle School, what that looks like and where those funds come from, and when there's money that does come from certain types of funding sources from Shelby County Commission, what that means for the municipal districts as far as our capital dollars that we could receive or utilize. And so I feel like our board, with our amazing legal recommendations and counsel, made a point to limit exposure from liabilities on the behalf of our board and our district, but also to make sure that we pointed out that in the event this new high school in Cordova is built with certain type of funds, that we do expect that we, along with the other municipal districts, will get our percentage of what we call the ADA share of those expenses. So we made a point to put that in the writing so that there was no confusion as to where we stood on that, and I really appreciate that being added. I think that it was our obligation, and I'm glad that it was included, and I'm glad that it's been accepted by the other three boards and bodies at this time.
And I'm very concerned about the ADA. I know, watching the county commission meeting yesterday, I didn't walk away from that feeling confident that was going to happen for us. But I think based on what our needs are, and again, I'm going to speak more to that a little bit later, particularly in regards to Houston High School, I think it's important that the ADA is paid on that, and I hope that the county commission will do the right thing.
Any words of wisdom, Ms. Superintendent Manuel?
No, I'm just thankful for this body and for our legal counsel to guide you all through this process.
Are there any further questions or discussion on this agenda item?
One logistical question. If we approve the resolution, does the current chairman execute it, since we'll be voting on a chairman afterwards, and if there's a chairman who potentially has recused from the vote, does that hypothetically
I think at that,
feel able to execute?
I think at that point, the vice chair would have to step in
Okay.
if that is the case. But we'll check with legal counsel as to whether or not current chair or following chair would be, would be executing. I would assume it would be current chair because it was executed during, under her tenure.
That's right. If you look at the order of the votes, it
Right.
actually occurs before the vote for the new chairs.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a very good question.
Question. If no further questions or discussion on agenda item number 3, that takes us to agenda item number 4, further business. Do we have any further business this evening? I want to thank Board Member Opperman for his especially thoughtful input, even talking about our elementary school capacity and modular use, and looking at it from the big picture as a representative of all students. So thank you, as always, for your excellent work. It's a pleasure serving with you. This meeting, the board work session for Germantown Board of Education, December 15th, 2022, is adjourned at 5:35 p.m.